very, very much, Evelyn and colleagues, for inviting me here. It is a huge thrill to be in Rio. I've never been to Brazil before. I've always wanted to come. And this is a wonderful opportunity to combine an ambition to go to Brazil with my passion for talking to people about theatre and architecture. So many thanks for that. I'll begin. In response to the concern so eloquently voiced in Evelyn's conference call about the conditions under which architecture and theatre are currently being made, my keynote presentation takes seriously the co-optation of these vital practices by late capitalism, but it's really aimed at exploring how, as architects and theatre makers operating within the globalized urban cultures of today, we might construct space-times in which we can begin to reclaim our agency as creative, critically alert citizens. As I stated in my abstract for this talk, I'm approaching this talk from the perspectives of socially engaged theatre and the continuing relevance of critical architecture. And I adopt a critical position that's informed by cultural materialist and Marxist theory. The brief studies of theatrical and architectural practice I'll be sharing with you this morning are not always the best examples of great theatre or great architecture. They are, however, examples that I consider index particular architectural, cultural, and theatrical problems in exemplary ways, and thus they might act as provocations to us in addressing questions of architecture, theatre, and culture throughout the rest of this conference week. The history of intersections between theatre and architecture is a fertile field, and it's worth further exploration. Here, though, I focus on what I think is worrying about this combination of practices now. Namely, that contemporary capitalism's reliance not only on all things affective, experiential, and immaterial, but also on all things urban and creative, binds theatre and architecture within a matrix of capitalism, cultural desire, and cultural production. It feels necessary to me to begin on this rather sobering note, because I think it's only really through our full consciousness of our present cultural context that we can best steer a more socially responsive and responsible course for future interdisciplinary practice. I'm not saying anything new when I note how the cities of the world's advanced and developing economies display a delirious visuality where buildings appear as sceno-sculptural statements or else as architectural scale screens. Guy Debord foresaw this as early as 1967. Today, though, and as Debord also feared, we've reached the point at which saleable images of and for urban space no longer seem sufficient to bring about the politico-economic aims of the capitalist class, and theatre and performance have been commandeered in order to inject new opportunities for participation and play into our experiences of urban space. In architect and brand consultant Anna Klingman's 2007 study of architecture in the capitalist experience economy, the special characteristic of the brandscape, one which marks it as qualitatively different from the city of the spectacle, is its ability to transform us as subjects from spectator consumers to willing and active participants. This approach to architecture and urban design draws heavily on the multisensorial and participatory modalities of much immersive and site-specific performance, and repeats the, in my view, rather dubious promise held out by these theatrical genres to emancipate spectators by affording them a more active role in the event. in attributing the success of the brandscape to its ability to engage us in playful exploration of the city, publications like Klingman's or Scott Lucas's The Immersive Worlds Handbook stress the social benefits to be had from certain kinds of performative architecture. The image you're looking at now, for instance, shows the winning design for an interactive mixed-use advertising billboard for Sunset Boulevard by Orange Barrel Media, Tom Wiscombe Architecture, and MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, which the client, West Hollywood, the creative city, it calls itself, maintains is a, quote, unique experience that integrates the community plaza with one-of-a-kind creative applications of state-of-the-art advertising, MoCA-curated public art experiences, and community interaction. Others take a more sceptical line. Debord's compatriot Jean Baudrillard, writing in Paris 68 during his early, more or less Marxist phase of political and sociological theory, pointed out that it's a mistake to imagine that capitalist repression is brought about through aggression. On the contrary, it feeds on our participation. By applying a layer of participation over the surface of built space, the powers behind today's creative cities are able to obscure their politico-economic aims, including the privatization of more and more space, behind what appears to be an inclusive, more democratic approach to architecture and urban design. So participation merges with the logic of the spectacle, or rather the brand. And the re-theatricalization of architecture embeds both architecture and theatre in the quest to improve the performance of previously unprofitable urban districts. The question of what happens to our cultural buildings and rituals when urban districts and landmarks are prized more as real estate than as neighbourhoods, and theatre is seen neither as art nor social practice, but as a creative industry, is one that I've been thinking about for some years. Similarly, the question of what defines architecture and of whether, in Peggy Deemer's provocative analysis, quote, all of architecture is a manifestation of capital, is an idea I explored in my short book, Theatre and Architecture, and that I continue to try to contest. Although theatre buildings form just one small part of urban regeneration programs, the fact that performing arts complexes are valued as a means to boost tourism and investment is a sore point for many theatre practitioners and scholars who've witnessed the theatre's traditional statement as a playhouse, a shared space in which to gather and explore social issues together, change to that of vehicle for social cleansing. I'm thinking of New York's Lincoln Center and how that sparked the eviction of a mainly Puerto Rican community in the early 1960s, and of the growing number of examples of theatre as a cause of social displacement today. Performance makers who in recent years have turned their backs on the theatre building, whether for artistic or political reasons or both, have in many instances reinforced the dynamic between theatre, architecture, cultural desire and capitalism. While some unhoused performance makers make site-specific work that is critically alert to questions of space and place, other predominantly metropolitan theatre companies are succumbing to a craze for so-called alternative theatre without entering into dialogue either with the properties of architecture or with the idea of architecture as property. In London, where I live and work, the practice of staging theatre inside premises that are leased out to creatives, that word again, has become a mainstay of entrepreneurialism, the fusing of art with entrepreneurial activity. The trend for these and other kinds of pop-up venues, which many performers view as underscoring the transience of their medium, and as avoiding the rigid structures of the theatre establishment, has unintended consequences. For if pop-ups offer theatre makers affordable short-term spaces, they also normalise the patterns of rapid development, precariousness and casualisation that are the very hallmarks of neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism. Against the troublesome backdrop to architecture and theatre which I've just described, I want to run through 3 very short examples of practices which I believe offer a more genuine alternative to the commodified forms of ephemeral architecture currently being exploited by civic and private urban stakeholders. The first 2 concern theatre architecture, community and performance. The third is a work of ephemeral architecture that harnesses performance and participation in order to rethink approaches to the design of a potentially very broad spectrum of cultural, domestic, and social spaces. So number 1, La Carpa, an art, circus, and theatre complex built by architect-activist Santiago Cirugueda on land that had been squatted for over a year by the theatre director Jorge Barroso of Varuma Theatre Company. The complex was put together as a mobile kit of recycled parts in order to provide Varuma with a base from which to develop performances and teach circus skills to members of an economically devastated local community. Varuma shared La Carpa's various separate spaces, the big tops, the spider office, the refrigerated truck and various other things that you see in this image, with several other performance collectives who were invited to develop art and education programs so long as they had a clear cultural or social purpose. Crowd-funded and independently managed and maintained, La Carpa might be said to have operated as a temporary autonomous zone where official forms of culture, education and urban governance were suspended and a grassroots alternative established in their place. Between 2010 and 2014, when it was closed down by the authorities of Seville, La Carpa offered shelter for the homeless and performances and training workshops to tens of thousands of local people, schooling them in circus skills and in self-build projects so that they would no longer be forced to consume the services of architects or buy into the mainstream notion of theatre as commercial product. Quick example number 2. Since its inauguration in 2012, TAT, which is short for Theatre as Architecture, Architecture as Theatre, has been developing an increasingly open-ended approach to questions of spatial dramaturgy and architecture, abandoning the idea of the theatre building as the conventional architectural end product of an expert design, and setting aside too the notion that theatrical performance is something which is shown by trained actors to a silently seated body of spectators. Architect Brecht Hormans and dramatist-director Gert-Jan Stam provided participants in their 2014 Core 2 project with a manual for building a performance pavilion through a process they termed choreography, a do-it-yourself playtext with scripted suggestions for acts of performance and spectatorship, and a set of post-show provocations urging people to discuss how they might share their experiences of building and performing in order to stimulate further, more fully self-directed initiatives in community theatre and architecture. Quick example number 3. the performance architecture of Alex Schrader, seen here, and his sometime collaborator, the artist Ward Shelley. That's Ward. Performance architecture, so called to acknowledge its debt to performance art and to distinguish it from some of the more gimmicky, high-tech performative architectures of recent years, explores the possibilities for a more socially engaged design methodology. In Schrader and Shelley's architect-performed buildings, performance architecture is a form of practice-based research into architecture's relationship to the social rituals of everyday life, and thus also a means for reappraising architecture's role in society. To pick just one example from the duo's growing body of work in this field, stability took the form of an inhabitable beam raised off the ground via a central pivot. The work was conceived as part of a triptych of social relationship architectures, and it set out to test the possibilities and problems of inhabitation, cohabitation, and social interdependency. Its seesaw-like form allowed for two self-contained and individually furnished live-work areas to be located at either end of the beam, but it made the successful use of one occupant's space dependent on the position and weight of the other occupant. In this way, the work caricatured some of the cultural desires and conflicts that attach to lived space, enabling the occupants and their audiences to gain new perspectives on issues to which we may have become blind. For instance, as Shelley and Schrader performed the routine tasks of their daily existence, they ensured that their actions would index a range of other actions, interactions, and consequences that can tip the balance at a variety of different scales and in a multitude of places. In a very real sense, stability turned on what we might think of as a key Lefebvrean problematic. That is, that space and the political organization of space express social relationships, but also reflect back on them. And it asked us to make positive choices about the way we share a variety of different spaces with others. Using the explicitly theatrical dynamics of performance and spectatorship, the project resituated architecture, not as player in the performative brandscapes of the experience economy, but as a socially turned practice. A slightly longer example, we're going back to theatre architecture again now, this time in Uksan village in Kamshet, Western India. The company theatre relocated to the Uksan Hills in Kamshet in 2012. Their new home was built by an inexperienced local architect at the behest of internationally renowned theatre director Atul Kumar. The Uksan retreat consists of a complex of residential, social, and studio spaces set over a 5-acre lakeside site. The location is remote enough to have been affordable by Kumar and his wife, the company co-director Rachel D'Souza, but at around a 3-hour drive from the cities of Mumbai and Pune, it is still accessible by urban audiences who can stay overnight in one of the 2 lime-washed rough brick cottages which TCT found at site. I've never visited Uksan, although I am aware of the pressures facing theatre makers in Mumbai, where property prices rival those of Manhattan, and where there's long been a paucity of facilities for devising or even rehearsing work in advance of taking a show into production. My curiosity about TCT's theatre and residential retreat was aroused through the editorial relationship I've enjoyed with architect and academic Himanshu Burt, who's contributed a chapter to the forthcoming book Performing Architectures, co-edited by my long-term collaborator Andrew Filmer and myself. So the following description of a visit to Oksan is Himanshu's, and this is what he writes. Anticipation mounted as I drove through beautiful hills around sunset during my first trip to the residency in February 2014 for the night-long Kamshet Theatre Festival hosted by TCT. Car parked in the lit playground of the village school, I followed the suspended paper lanterns from the gate in a curving walk till a house came into view. Set on a plateau sloping down to the dark trees, it looked like an outsized, big-boned bungalow. The scale was a bit off to my archetype's eye. The sloping RCC roof was also too thick and was inadequately visually anchored to the mass below. The detailing was patchy, and the building did not seem to embody TCT's ethos of cultural hybridity and radical experimentation. As an informal collaborator with Kumar during the conceptualization of the project, and having enjoyed the inventive spatiality of his theatre, I was disappointed. As the chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that the project is not a successful example of theatre architecture by the standards of any conventional assessment. As a place for presenting theatre, the residency has an open-air stage at the foot of an unpaved natural slope, approximating a Greek amphitheatre, and it also has a modest studio-cum-living room with a semi-sprung teak floor measuring around 6 meters by 11. Here it is now. And just to give you a sense of some of the other spaces, on the left of this slide you see a newly built loft which is used for guests. In the centre, a wide open space which is sometimes used for rehearsal and or performance, but which is also the cafe or canteen area. And on the right, a bedroom made inside one of the two huts which were already in existence. So one could hardly claim that this is a revolution in theatre architecture. However, as I've indicated already, the architecture is not regarded as fixed or finite. And the fact that every space on the site is viewed as a potential performance space is one of two things about this project that I think are really significant. What first brought about this permissive attitude towards the building was that the architecture was not only rudimentary, but was actually unworkable in places. It's bad architecture. But it's bad architecture that might just teach us something about how to do architecture that supports creative and social life. Let me explain. Himanshu notes that changes had to be made from the very moment that the company moved in. But it is since that first lot of changes that something seems to have happened. That something is that TCT has started regarding changes to the built fabric of the retreat as a positive benefit to social and artistic life. By accident at first, and then more deliberately, the company has established an alternative architectural performativity, one that is rooted in shifting citational processes and the promotion of spatial work over architectural end product. Himanshu's description of a theatre company and a theatre architecture coming to terms with one another resonates strongly for me, as I have charted a similar process of iterative performance-led theatre architecture at London's Battersea Art Centre, where Howard Tompkins architects set out with an exploratory approach to a Victorian town hall turned art centre, making interventions that would, over a period of years, feed into later modifications of the space ad infinitum. Both of these cases model a change in architecture practice from industry demands for deterministic space planning to greater sensitivity to users' needs and to allowing for change over time. A second point I'd like to make about this project grows out of a contextual discussion that Himanshu provides about some of the obstacles Kumar faced in Oksan. There's a kind of subplot to Himanshu's chapter about the theatre project which interests him somewhat less than it interests me. This subplot tells the all too familiar Globan urban tale of patterns of gentrification, displacement and social tension. There was real friction in 2012 between the villagers of Uxan and this group of metropolitan artistes who didn't even speak the same language as the people who'd worked the land there for generations. But we get a sense by the chapter's close that the theatre community and the villagers are beginning to negotiate some sort of uneasy peace. Kumar now buys his construction materials locally, while visiting artists have initiated workshops for local children at the village school. So the iterative architecture that has by now become a consciously acknowledged characteristic of theatre making at Uxan is also the means by which unlikely social and cultural alliances are being forged. And what will be fascinating to observe about this geographical placement, this architecture, and this clash of social castes and cultures is the degree to which different groups of people are able to act together and to assume responsibility for one another. Moreover, I would suggest that Kumar and D'Souza's growing contact with the Uxan villagers will at some stage begin to feed into the company's performance practice. TCT is already known for its inventive blending of classic and folk forms of traditional Indian theatre and European drama. And my prediction when I was supporting Himanshu with the writing and refining of his chapter was that we are likely to see an expansion of TCT's work to include applied performance and pedagogical art practices. In fact, to my delight, I spotted this notice on TCT's website just a few days ago. I'm going to give English readers a chance to have a look and see what this says, and our translator, Rebecca, is going to read the words in Portuguese.